You could please move to the next slide. So welcome everyone to the third session of our 2022-23 Forest and Climate Learning Exchange series. I'm your host, Catherine Maloney, and I'm the private sector liaison for the Forest Carbon and Climate Program at Michigan State University. I want to give a quick thanks to our co-host, the Society of American Foresters, or SAF. SAF is the national scientific and educational organization representing forestry and related natural resource professionals across the United States. Founded in 1900, SAF promotes science-based sustainable management and stewardship of the nation's public and private forests. Similarly, we'd like to thank our additional sponsors, NCX and Renew West. For today's presentation, we'll be discussing the carbon footprint of a large global forest owner, a case study for Rayonier, Inc. We have Tom Fox joining us. So thank you, Tom, for being here. Before we hand it off to you, we're going to do a quick some housekeeping details. So to automatically receive registration details and information regarding upcoming webinars, please join our mailing list by emailing forestc@msu.edu. A recording of this session, along with a copy of the slides and any supplemental resources, will be posted to our site. The presentations will be followed by a Q&A session. You can either use the chat feature or the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom interface to submit your questions. We'll be moderating the chat throughout, and then we'll ask those questions during that Q&A session. If you're calling in on the phone, but you are able to email, you can also send questions directly to our mailing list at forestc@msu.edu. Next slide. Starting with the November 2nd session, attendees are qualified to receive CFE and SAF credits. The credits will be automatically applied if you registered for the event with the email associated with your SAF account. Similarly, attendees are qualified to receive CEU credits from ISA. Please email forestc@msu.edu to receive those credits. And with that, I will hand it over to Tom Fox.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. Yes. I'm going to share. Okay. I assume you can see the screen now. So thank you, Catherine. Appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit about Rayonier and our work with carbon. And so at the start, I wanted to make it clear that, you know, this is the work for one forest products company, one forestry company. That's why we call it a case study. There's a number of organizations that are doing things that are similar, but I can't speak for them, and I can't speak in generalities probably for the entire industry. With that, what I'd like to do is first I'm going to tell you a little bit about Rayonier. I bet 90% of the people on this call, maybe 100% of the people on this call don't know who Rayonier is. We're probably not a household name. So I'll tell you a little bit about our company and what we do, and then tell a little bit about the way we have approached calculating our carbon footprint. And then I'll summarize in pretty high level the carbon footprint that we have, talking about the standing carbon sequestration and those sort of things. Talk a little bit about the downstream effects of our carbon sequestration, particularly as it affects carbon stored in harvested wood products in use. And then obviously we'll have some time for questions at the end. Rayonier is we're a forest products company, structured as a real estate investment trust, and that's just a tax advantaged structure for a company to operate under. We've been in business almost 100 years now as Rayonier. With it, for most of that time, we were an integrated forest products company with pulp mills and sawmills and all that sort of manufacturing facilities. In 2014, we actually divested all of our manufacturing facilities into a separate standalone company. And so since that time, we've been just a forestry company. We started in 1926, and the name stands for Rayonier. Pretty much patented and invented the way to make dissolving cellulose out of Western hemlock that was suitable for rayon fibers and fabric. So if you ever worn a rayon shirt or anything, that's something that we pretty much invented. Had pulp mills that made that kind of fiber, and that's the rayon half of it. And then we were in Washington State, and so they could see Mount Rainier, so they made the name that way. We have about 400 employees in the company, and we harvest about 11 million tons of wood a year in that. We own about 3 million acres of forest land throughout the world, and it's in 3 primary areas. About 2 million acres are in the southern United States, essentially from Texas to Florida to South Carolina to Oklahoma. About 500,000 acres are in Washington and Oregon. Almost all of that is on the Coast Range and west side of Washington, Oregon. And then we also own about 420,000 acres in New Zealand. And that's fairly scattered from essentially the tip of the North Island to the tip of the South Island. I also wanted to mention, I said we started in 1926, but our legacy as a company actually dates back much further. Recently, we merged with another forestry company, Olympic Resources, and their legacy dates back to 1853. And what you see on this picture here is Port Gamble, Washington, where Pope and Talbot built a sawmill in 1853 when that was Oregon Territory. And by 1870, they owned about 300,000 acres of forest land. And the forest land you see here in the background was part of that, which we still own today. So the legacy of sustainable management as a company dates back to the mid-1800s in that case with it. We focus our efforts on conifer management. That's our expertise. And so in the southern United States, we manage southern pine, loblolly pine, slash pine, longleaf pine, and plant the right species on the right soil and manage fairly intensively. In the Northwest, we manage both Douglas fir and Western hemlock, again, site-specific and intensive management. And then in New Zealand, we manage primarily radiata pine, plant a little bit of Doug fir, and a little bit of a hybrid between radiata pine and Pinus attenuata. And again, the same principles of our management is site-specific management and pretty intensive management of the forest to produce the wood products that we want. It's also important to recognize that in all 3 of the regions that we operate, roughly a third of our land base is actually in non-plantations. So much of it in the southern United States is in native hardwoods, such as you see here. Most of that's associated along major streams and rivers, as well as in SMZs and those sort of things. In Washington, Oregon, a lot of the land is in riparian management zones associated with Forest Practices Act regulations. And then in New Zealand, about a third of the land base is actually in native forest in New Zealand, as much of it the native podocarp forest that would have existed prior to settlement in New Zealand. And it's an important resource for us to manage in all 3 areas. We have 3 business segments, if you will. One of them is obviously forestry, which is the most important. As any large landowner that's owned land for a long time, what seems to have happened is the cities have come out to meet us, and it's no longer so rural in some cases. And so we have a real estate division that tries to sustainably develop property and manage that development to some extent. And then we have a natural resource division that focuses on non-forestry or non-timber assets. And there you see a wind farm that we have in Oklahoma with it as an example of that kind of activity. We focus on sustainability. We're committed to sustainable forestry in all regions that we operate in, essentially focusing on that concept of intergenerational equity. And providing both the products and then the ecosystem services. And that obviously requires us to balance really the three aspects of sustainable forestry, which one is the ecology and biology, if you will, of growing trees sustainably. We focus also on the environmental, social governance side of the business so that we're good neighbors in the community. And then obviously as a private enterprise with investors, we have to focus on the financial state sustainability of our company. We're certified in everywhere we operate. In the United States, we're certified under the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. In New Zealand, we're certified under the Forest Stewardship Council practices. And both of those are part of the PEFC program as well. So, and so as a large landowner as well, and our focus on sustainability, we recognize that we have two main business lines, if you will, on the forestry side. We grow trees, harvest trees, replant trees, regrow trees, reharvest trees to produce the products from the woods. And so that includes timber into the domestic market, timber into the export market. We export timber from both the US and New Zealand, primarily focused on the Pacific Rim. So Japan, Korea, China, Vietnam, India. We also harvest and capture a lot of what we might call minor forest products, everything from gallberry honey produced in the Southeast to pine straw production to salal that's used as a horticultural in producing flowers and arrangements and things. As I said, we have a real estate division, and then we have activities associated with minerals and energy. So you own land and there's gas and oil deposits. There's fill dirt, all those sort of things that come from the forest, the land that you own. And then on the ecosystem services side, obviously, we deal with aesthetics, biodiversity, water and wetlands. T&E species are really important to us, obviously. Hunting and recreational activities on the land that we own. And then why we're here today is obviously talk about carbon, which is another extremely important ecosystem service that we provide. As a company focused on sustainability, obviously we're interested in climate change and how that will impact our forest and how we need to modify our management to address climate change issues, but also how we can use our forest to help mitigate climate change through carbon sequestration and those sort of things. And we're all interested in the carbon cycle in the forests and how the forests can capture carbon that's emitted from industrial activities, store that in the forest. We're also interested in how that carbon is retained outside the forest. And so in some cases, how that is turned into wood products and used and how long that lasts. Turned to biomass energy and those kind of opportunities. And then obviously we're interested in how damaging agents to the forest, insects, diseases, fire affect the forest and again, return that carbon back to the atmosphere. So trying to manage the carbon in this broader context of not just the forest, but also understanding the products in use, as well as the impacts of damaging agents in the forest. And our premise coming out of IPCC is really this idea that well-managed forest, and what we talk about as working forest, where products are harvested, they provide this natural climate solution. And that really, if we're going to achieve our goals under IPCC's guidance, whether it's a 1.5 or whatever the opportunity is today, we're going to need to have forests contribute in two ways, really. One is through long-term carbon sequestration in the forests and in the products that are being used, and also the ability to use carbon offsets. And so some entities and organizations are not going to be able to reduce fully their carbon emissions to reach any kind of net zero targets. And so carbon offsets may be an important component of their efforts to reach a net zero situation. So I'll tell you at this point a little bit about our carbon footprint and how we've approached this as a company. And so we started about 6 years ago, really trying to dig into this and understand what our role was in terms of helping to sequester and store carbon, and then how does that impact the atmospheric carbon situation. So it's been a fairly long road for us, and we continue to refine and revise and hopefully improve that every year that we do our analyses. And so what we wanted to do as we thought through this a number of years ago was we wanted to understand as much about our carbon footprint as we could. And so we wanted to understand how much carbon is stored in the forest that we own. How much do we sequester each year? Is that a positive or a negative sort of thing? How much do we remove in the timber that we harvest? And then where does that carbon go? How much is stored in products? How much goes back into the atmosphere? And then what are our emissions for the management activities that we do to grow the trees that we produce? You know, there were stories that, oh, you know, forest management is going to have such a large emission status, but that we won't be able to, you know, we'll need to reduce that. And so the approach we took was we wanted to do kind of a life cycle analysis of the carbon in the forests. And we did that as essentially a cradle to gate analysis. We felt it was best for us to deal with carbon in the value chain that we could control, and understand our carbon footprint in that context. And then we did want to look at sort of the downstream effects of the carbon that is in the trees that we harvest and is turned into wood products, because it's pretty, we think that's an important aspect of having a complete picture of forests as a part of the climate change solution, if you will. We wanted to estimate the carbon, obviously as CO2 equivalents, but as a large company, we wanted to include both the US and New Zealand, and that presented a couple of problems for us that I'll talk about in terms of trying to make sure those were consistent approaches to both how we deal with it in the US and New Zealand. We wanted to do as complete an inventory or a complete as analysis as we could, include the trees, understory vegetation, coarse woody debris, forest floor, the mineral soil, you know, the total ecosystem carbon that exists. And we wanted to understand the standing carbon, but then also the sequestration in each of those ecosystem components. From an emission standpoint, from our standpoint, we wanted to do both scope 1 and scope 2, but it was also important for us to do scope 3 because most of our emissions are actually scope 3 emissions that are not directly controlled by us, but are created in response to what we do as a company. And so we looked at scope 3 emissions. As I said, we're interested in how much carbon is in the timber we harvest, and then finally, what happens to that stored in wood products, both in domestic and for us, again, these export markets were important for us to understand because of our large amount of export that we do. And then as we thought through this, we also wanted to understand how to make this an open and transparent process. And as we looked at a number of years ago, carbon data that we saw, one of the things we found difficult to understand was how other organizations or other entities produce the numbers. You know, we saw a number, we have this much carbon or something like that, and we didn't really understand how they came to that number. And so we felt it was important to do the analysis that we did is an open and transparent process. So a number of things guided us in that context. One is we did not want to use any proprietary data or proprietary growth and yield models or things we couldn't share with anybody. that it had behind kind of hide behind the corporate proprietary data kind of thing. And so we decided to make our carbon footprint calculations based on data that we disclose annually in our 10K or annual report. So it's available publicly. And it's possible for anybody to go in to look at our 10K, use our methodology, and come up pretty close to the same number we calculate carbon from. So, people don't believe what we're doing, they can check and see if we're doing a good job. We wanted to clearly describe the methods and the calculations and provide as much reference material so that other people could say, yeah, that's good, or that's not very good. And then for both the data and the methods, we wanted to focus, as I said, not on our internal growth and yield models or proprietary data, but use methods that were developed and published primarily by governmental agencies. We felt that was important for credibility. And then if we needed to, we would be willing to use peer-reviewed journal articles and then cite those references. So there's a few cases where we ended up having to do that. And then for us, as a company, we are required in New Zealand under their compliance program, the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, to follow a specific methodology that's used in New Zealand. And that's basically to use a carbon stock change approach to carbon accounting based on yield tables and lookup tables produced by the New Zealand Ministry of Primary Industries. And so that was, if we're going to be consistent in the US and New Zealand, we had to figure out a way to do something similar in the US. And we ended up selecting similar yield tables that were produced by the US Forest Service in a pretty well-known document, the General Technical Report 343, which is the methods for calculating forest ecosystem and harvested carbon with standard estimates for forest types in the United States. That's kind of the work of Jim Smith, Linda Heath, Kenneth Skog, and Rich Birdsey. So fairly well-recognized document. We used EPA data as much as we could for emissions and emission factors in that. And then the most important data that we used from a peer review was a paper by Manley and Evison that summarized the carbon in harvested wood products in exported wood. And so that was a large component of our business, and that wasn't covered by either the US Forest Service or New Zealand Ministry of Primary Industries. So we were forced to use that. And as part of this open process, I'm here today, we're welcome comments, and are we doing, how could we improve this so that we could come up with a better approach. It was also important to recognize, as a private company that trades on public stock exchanges, that any of our carbon report is actually a financial disclosure. And that's extremely important to a company that is responsible for making that, because the information we disclose in our carbon report, as well as our financial information, is what the public and investors can use to make a decision whether or not to buy our company stock. And so has to be done in as good a way as we can, so that it's consistent and well researched. And there's this, people are probably familiar, right? There's this growing sentiment that we need to create a uniform and consistent set of standards for doing this, so that there's a uniformity to it. And actually, the Security and Exchange Commission's kind of announced that they're going to start have a set of mandatory disclosures related to climate change and carbon, and follow their rules. So again, that becomes very important to us to comply with SEC rules, obviously. And then one of the things that came out of our work, obviously, is this understanding that, that we needed better standardization. And so we've been involved pretty, for the last few months, pretty deeply in understanding the things like the greenhouse gas protocol developed by WRI and the World Business Council for the land sector. And we're part of the pilot testing program to test those guidance and things. And really our goal or hope is that we can develop a standardized system for greenhouse gas accounting that is analogous to GAAP accounting for financial metrics, so that there's a clear, fair, and workable solution for all organizations. with it. So with that kind of introduction, what we did is we've calculated our carbon footprint annually since 2019. So we've done it 3 years in a row, and we continue to plan to report on that annually for the future. If you're interested, our carbon reports are available on our website, along with our sustainability reports. So they're at www.rayonier.com/sustainability. So you can see the work that we've done in that context. And I'll just kind of quickly summarize it for you. Before I guess I get to that, is talk a little bit about the approach that we did. So as we analyzed this, we made a decision that since we were going to report on carbon annually, every year on December 31st of the year, we take a complete snapshot, if you will, of our the information available that we have on our land base in our geographic information system. That is all of the forests that we own, every stand, all of the stand characteristics, their age, their species, acres, all that information, and that's archived, and that represents a year-end snapshot. And we felt that was the most useful point in time to do the analysis of our carbon footprint. So it's based on that December 31st timeframe. And what that means is, and we decided, is that represents all the forest that we own that day. If there was any forest that we sold during the year, it would be excluded because it would not be part of that database anymore. If we didn't own it, it was removed from that database sometime during the year. Likewise, if we purchased forest land, it would be included because it would stand there. And then the other thing that's important is this represents a net standing carbon and net sequestration, because any stands that we harvested would have removed from that inventory and have zero volume and therefore zero carbon in them. So they're a net of all the harvesting that we did to the year. So our approach is trying to present what would be described as a net stock, and then for sequestration, a net stock change over the year. And we felt that was the most credible way to report, because any large organization, we're harvesting timber every day, we're buying and selling land all the time, and so it just seemed like the cleanest way to do that for us. So here's kind of a snapshot of it. And so the standing carbon that we have in the forest, and this would be total ecosystem carbon. So this would be the trees in the carbon in the overstory trees, including above and below ground carbon. It would include the carbon in the understory vegetation. It would include the carbon in the forest floor, coarse woody debris, and the soil. And so you can see in the forest, and this is both US and New Zealand, it's a total for US and New Zealand. At that point in time, December 31st, 2020, I'm just giving you the 2020 data in this presentation, we had about 406 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent stored in our forests on the 3 million, on the acres that we owned. And about 352 million were in the US and about 54 million were in New Zealand with that. And then the soil, we had 351 million metric tons of carbon in the soil. So the total would be 757 million metric tons of carbon as CO2 equivalents in the forest. And so if you think about that if we calculate that, that's about the equal to the emissions of about 158 million people annually is what we have stored. Trying to put it in context with that. So fairly large number for that. And pretty much as you would expect, roughly 50-50, about half the carbon's in the soil, half the carbon's in the above ground ecosystem with that. So we also then wanted to calculate the sequestration that we have in those forests. And so what we used were the carbon lookup tables and followed the procedures that's outlined again in that GTR 343 in terms of interpolating between two different age classes in order to calculate the carbon that would be sequestered in that context. And so we are able to calculate how much carbon would have grown in that forest during the year. Again, net of all removals or additions in that case. And so when we ran that calculation, you can see that the sequestration in the forest was 14.5 million metric tons, with about 11.8 in the US and 2.7. And there's one piece that's an anomaly in the data, and it's just the way the data is presented, is that in both cases, the US and New Zealand, there's an underlying assumption that forest soils are static and that the carbon does not change in the forest soil. And so there's no sequestration in the soil. And that's an important aspect of how we approach the data is we made the decision that we were not going to modify any of the tables, any of the data, or any of the approaches that were proposed by either the New Zealand Ministry of Primary Industries or US Forest Service in GTR 343. As a soil scientist, I'm not sure that the soils are fully static. Actually, I'm pretty sure that there's carbon sequestration going on and there's carbon emissions going on in the soil. But we've done that as a research exercise, but are not including that in any of our analyses for outside, because it's not vetted, if you will, outside those publications. And again, so that the carbon we sequestered in 2020 is equal to, if we took about 3 million cars off the road, is one way to think about that. And so that was sort of our ecosystem carbon and sequestration. And a pretty nice number. If our annual sequestration is 14 million metric tons. But we then went, well, how much do we emit on an annual basis? And so we did a detailed analysis primarily through our accounting system. So we went back to understand all of the activities that we perform that emit carbon. And we used EPA and New Zealand emission factors to then calculate how much carbon was associated with all the different things that we do. And we did that for scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which are those emissions that we control, as well as our scope 3 emissions. So scope 2 emissions, as you probably know, right, are the purchased electricity. So, we had our administrative assistants go back to every power bill, every electric bill we had, calculate the kilowatt hours that we used during the year. We would then go to look at the emission factor for kilowatt hours per each of the grid units in the United States and calculate the emissions from that. So our scope 3 or scope 2 electricity emissions were about 0.6 million metric tons of that. So a relatively small amount. We also looked at company vehicles and company assets that we own. And so those are bulldozers and equipment, trucks, and all that we own, four-wheelers, lawnmowers, and how much fuel they used essentially during the year. And you can see that as our scope 1 emissions, also about 0.6. And then as you can see, most of our activity and emissions are associated with scope 3 emissions because we do almost all of our forest management activities with contractors that work for us and work with us to manage the land. And so they're not a scope 1 emission because we don't control them. We don't own that asset, but we do, ask them to do things. And so we feel it's important to account for that. So you can see community development represents the activities for any real estate that we developed. So if they build a road or put in infrastructure or something like that, that would be what's associated with our community development. Our timber harvesting, so that represents the harvesting of trees, skidding the trees to the landing and loading them onto a truck. And that's pretty big, 82,000 metric tons. Road construction, for associated with forest roads we construct. The trucking from the harvest area to the primary mill We're a large exporter, as I said, so ocean freight. What is the carbon cost of moving logs from the different ports that we have in the United States or New Zealand to the destination ports in Japan, China, Korea, India, Vietnam? Our business travel, that includes both mileage of trucks that we drive that are not owned by the company, associated with our business, also air flights and those sort of things. And then our silvicultural practices, planting, site prep, fertilization, herbaceous weed control, thinning, all the activities that we do on the land base. And so you can see each of those, and the sum of all of our emissions across the globe was about 380,000 metric tons. Again, 262 in the US and 118,000 in New Zealand. Also a big number. But one of the things that's, if you think about that, right? So we calculate based on all these methodologies that we sequester each year 14.5 million metric tons, and our emissions are 380,000 metric tons, which would suggest, based on the data and the analysis, that our net emissions are negative roughly 14 million metric tons a year. And so as a company, we are essentially net negative emissions today. And that's not too surprising, right? Our whole business is just managing photosynthesis. We grow the trees and they sequester carbon. And that's, they do that 24/7. I kind of joke sometimes, we invented, a machine that takes carbon out of the atmosphere at a very low cost and stores it for a long, long period of time. We just call it a tree. But it's an incredibly efficient process. And it's why forests are so important in this whole question about natural climate solutions and impact that we can have on climate change, is because of that large net negative sequestration, the negative carbon emissions that we have. So then, as I said, we've already accounted for the carbon in the harvested wood products because we don't include them in our stock change because they're already removed by the end of the year. But we did want to look at that as a downstream kind of analysis. So we calculated the carbon in the wood that we harvested each year. And so that's basically calculating the volume of harvest in each species, in each region, using specific gravity, moisture content, carbon concentration in the wood to go from tons of wood to metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And so in 2020, our harvest total was translated to about 9.2 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents that were removed from the forest in the wood that we harvest that year. And again, you can see the distribution between US and New Zealand, about 7.6 million in the US and 1.6 million metric tons in New Zealand. And that again goes into products that everybody uses every day, whether it's lumber, paper, plywood, biomass energy, all the different end uses that we produce. And so that begged the question, if you will, well, where does that carbon go? And so what we wanted to look at, I'm sorry, I should have done this first, just to show you that the carbon summary through time has been fairly consistent. We've done our carbon report in 2019, 2020, 2021, and you can see the land base that we included, and that goes up because we're buying land. We like to own forest land, so we buy as much as we can. The carbon in the ecosystem has gone up associated with the land we own. Net carbon sequestration is pretty consistent. The emissions are pretty consistent. So again, we end up with a pretty consistent analysis done on a year-over-year basis. And so the question that we ask is, well, what happens to the carbon that we harvested? And so based on the analyses that have been done and things like the US Forest Service in New Zealand, they calculate the carbon stored in forest products through time. And it's essentially a negative exponential decay function. And so you can calculate the K value for that and then calculate the carbon remaining from that wood at any point of time. And there's a different K value for pulpwood, pulp versus saw timber. There's a different K value for wood that's exported to China than Japan than Korea for the different products it in. And so we did that calculation for all domestic and all export wood to each of the products that we produce from that. So if it went to a sawmill or a pulp mill or a plywood plant or MDF plant for both domestic and export markets, and sum that all together through time over a 100-year period to figure out how much of that carbon from the roughly 9 million tons that we harvest, where does that exist through time? There's a conversion efficiency issue. So as soon as we harvest it and it's turned into products, some of it doesn't get into those products. And then through time, we can see how much of that carbon is remaining, both in the US and New Zealand. And so after 5 years in use of the original, essentially 9.2 million metric tons we had, there's like, 4.7 is still in use, a little under 50%. As we get out 25 years, it's about 2.7, a little about 20%. Even after 100 years, it's about 1.7 million metric tons. So that's a good story. Carbon stays around in those products in a long time. And that got us to thinking as well, because we realized, well, in the southern United States, our average rotation length for pine is somewhere around 22, 23, 25 years. In the Northwest, it's about 50 years for Douglas fir. It's about 50 years for hardwoods in the South, and also about 25 years for pine in New Zealand. And so we realized that the carbon that's in these products will still be there when we harvest the next rotation and replant it, and then put more carbon into products in use from that. And so it becomes a cumulative effect. And so we made some assumptions and tried to look at what is that cumulative effect of multiple rotations through time on the carbon stored in wood products. So we can see here, essentially the same data, just presented as multiple rotations through time. So this is rotation 1 for the US and New Zealand. And through time, you can see that decreases. But after 25 years, we have another portion of the carbon in products produced from the pine that's harvested in the southern US and New Zealand. And then that rotation declines. And then after 50 years, we have another rotation that comes in, and then that declines. And then after 75 years, we have another rotation. And then after 100 years, we have a third. So what you see is the carbon stored in the wood products through time continues to increase because of that long-term storage. And that's a really important piece. And that's, that comes all the way back to the IPCC report, which talks about the importance of carbon stored in harvested wood products with it. And so that's, I think, a really important piece. And then what we also want to then do is what is the cumulative impact, not only of the harvested wood products, but then multiple rotations of the forest over that time. And we wanted to compare that. What's the difference? What would be the difference if we continue our current practice of managing the forest, cut the forest, harvest the forest, put it in products, replant it, versus what if we just planted the trees and walked away and didn't harvest again? What would the difference be? And so that's what this analysis shows. And so what we have here is the carbon accumulation in a situation where we plant the forest and walk away and never harvest again. And we did make the assumption as a business, if we did that, we would probably not manage that very intensively. We couldn't afford to invest in very elite genetics or in really in intensive silviculture to accomplish that. So we assumed that would be done at a relatively low intensity scale. And then we contrasted that to our current management, which includes relatively short rotations in the southern United States. Essentially we said about 25 years, with intensive management. And we can see that the carbon does accumulate in the forest if we do nothing and walk away, but that we accumulate more carbon and more rapidly with intensive management. And then when we harvest it and replant it, we repeat that over and over and over, and we end up with 4 rotations. And you will notice that these baselines continue to increase with time, and that's due to the products. So when you add the products and you add the wood in the forest, we end up with storing more carbon in the forest with harvested wood products than we would just letting the trees grow alone, at least on this analysis. And so that's an important, I think, component that we have to understand, because the question that we have to determine, all of us as part of society, is what's the best way to use forest as a natural climate solution? And I think this confirms data from the Forest Service and others that says probably the better solution is to grow the forest, use the forest, put the wood into long-term forest products and store that, and then regrow the forest and grow the forest intensively so that we sequester more carbon through time. And I think that's an important take-home message. So again, the conclusions, if you will, we store 750 million metric tons in the forest, and that's really the result of, 100 years of sustainable forest management that we still have that. We sequester about 14 million metric tons. We emit about 380. And so net, negative emissions. We remove about 9.2 million tons in the wood. That gets into products that are stored over multiple decades. And so there's almost 12 million metric tons equivalent in the wood products. And it looks like more carbon is going to be stored in forests and wood products over multiple harvest cycles with replanting, regrowth, and storage in products than if we envision a future with no further harvests of our forests. And again, I would direct you to this carbon report if you are so inclined to look at that. And again, our take-home points that we think is credibility is key. We're trying to be as credible and as open as we can. Transparency as well. We want to be consistent. That's why we look year over year over year. How is that consistent? It's important to be comprehensive and talk about total ecosystem carbon. Identify some of the gaps and weaknesses so that we can work on them, such as soil carbon. Think about annual sequestration, but also multiple rotations over time. And again, the importance of harvested wood products. We're not taking credit for the carbon stored in those wood products. That's probably somebody else's credit, but it's important to understand how the forest plus wood products contributes in a broader scale to again, these natural climate solutions with it. And so with that, I think hopefully I've left 15 minutes or so for questions, and happy to try and answer any questions. And there you have my email. If your question's not answered or you want to have more of a dialogue with it, I'm happy to try and communicate with anybody or talk to anybody about it.
Thank you, Tom. We've got about 10 minutes left here for questions, so let's dive right in. One of the questions I had about the carbon storage in harvested wood products is you had talked about how it's estimated based on the half-life of the products produced from the timber. And I was wondering, does Rayonier have a firm grasp then on what types of products are produced from their timber?
Yeah, so when we sell timber, we sell logs and stuff, we know we sell it to an end user. So we know the exact mill that it's going to. We can track it to a mill if you want it. So we know in all of our domestic where that ended up. We also know where it's sold to and what it's used in export markets. So that's part of our normal accounting procedures to track where our wood goes and who uses it and what the product that's being produced from that is. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Do the approaches to sustainable forest management vary across the U.S. regions? And if so, does that present a challenge?
Well, forest management changes obviously varies across the U.S. Obviously, what we do in the southern United States with loblolly slash pine is different, maybe even than what we do with longleaf pine or bottomline hardwoods or whatever. Very different than Douglas fir or western hemlock, and very different somewhat, to New Zealand. So yes, it does vary. The approach to sustainability doesn't really, in that the concept of what we need to do in terms of having a sustainable forest is similar. The SFI principles are essentially the same for the southern United States as they are for the Pacific Northwest. How we get to those is a little bit different based on how we manage it, based on the species, the soil, the climate, all the things that we have to deal with.
We've got a question here about the methodology that you use, and someone has asked, have you had drafts of your carbon reports peer reviewed before publishing to have others verify your methodology?
We did. When we initially did it, we had people that had worked with, in the U.S., for example, the Forest Service approach. So we had several folks peer review it and look at our methodology. Did the same thing in New Zealand with that. Primarily either university scientists, or folks that worked in those areas that were familiar with it. We don't do it every year. We don't want to keep overburdening, everybody with, can you look at our project again? But the first year and two, and we'll probably redo that again if for example, the greenhouse gas protocol gets approved and we have to change what we do. We'll obviously have to have that peer review again to make sure that we're doing it appropriately.
I guess just another question on your methodology. You discussed your commitment to transparency, and with that, you kind of restricted yourself to using that 10K data for your carbon. Has that provided any limitations in your calculations, restricting yourselves to that data?
No, not really, because what we have to do is put our data into the format that U.S. Forest Service and New Zealand Primary Industries uses. And so that's what we end up having to do. So there is a step where you have to take, like we have every forest that we own, every stand that we own is classified into a species, whereas the U.S. Forest Service data is classified into species groups. So our first step is to extract all of our data at that December 31st and convert it to U.S. Forest Service classification system based on regions, species groups, age classes, so that it can be used out of that. But you could do the same thing with the data in the 10K if you were so inclined, and put it into those classification groups and then use the lookup tables to calculate the carbon based on the acres and the species groups that exist.
We've got a question here about climate smart forestry. Would you say that Rayonier is currently practicing climate smart forestry?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a climate change analysis. We've understand using data on all the data we can acquire on what the climate change is. The impacts are regional, obviously, in terms of how climate will affect it, rainfall, temperature, this sort of things. So we do things like we have a tree improvement program where we look at our tree improvement program. What's the best families, genotypes, species to use as we anticipate climate change? So we're making those changes. We change silvicultural practices. We're using, in places where we anticipate more droughts, we're tending to use more containerized seedlings that are more drought resistant. So yeah, we're implementing climate smart forestry, trying to look at the climate in each of the regions that we operate in, and how do we have to adjust what we do. Some of it's positive, right? I mean, higher CO2, higher rainfall, longer growing season. on a plant that grows by photosynthesis, where the greatest limiting factor on photosynthesis is diffusion of CO2 through the stomates, growth is increasing. There's tons of data that out there that says CO2 is positive, and we see that. So, you know, there's both positive and negative things about climate change that we have to understand with it.
To what extent does Rayonier monetize its sequestration or carbon storage?
In New Zealand, the New Zealand government has what's known as the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, which is a compliance market that we are obligated to participate in. And so we do monetize carbon through New Zealand units, and we sell those into the carbon market as part of that government sanctioned compliance market, because there are entities that have to buy the emissions units in order to meet their goals under the New Zealand system. In the US, it's a voluntary market, and we have not participated in any of the voluntary markets to date because we are worried about the credibility of those markets and the impacts of quality credits and what that's viewed. And we don't think our reputational risk of selling credits that are uncertain is worth it. And bluntly, the price in the voluntary market's awfully low and is falling right now. So, you know, at some point we believe that carbon credits will be an important asset. And part of our effort is obviously to understand that and be positioned and able to participate in those voluntary markets when it is right for us.
Could you speak a little about how Rayonier obtains their Scope 3 emissions data? There were a couple questions regarding this. One talking about the site prep contractors, loggers, wood haulers. And I think there was another question similarly related to the road construction as well.
Right. So we used primary data that we pay all of our, we have to pay our contractors, right? So part of that is how they charge us. So we know the equipment they use, we know how many acres they've done, and we know how long they're taking. So we're able to calculate based on the data that we accumulate from them, their fuel use, how many gallons of fuel. So we know a bulldozer uses so many gallons per hour and they charged us 3 hours. So we can calculate the fuel use in that bulldozer that day. And every gallon of diesel fuel has an emission factor. And so we take that and multiply it. And we do that for everything that we did. It was probably the most complicated and difficult aspect of this whole thing was to do that and to extract that data from all the various sources that we have. But that's essentially what we did for, you know, whether it's harvesting, you know, how many tons do we harvest? How many gallons of fuel you use per ton to harvest in cable versus ground base versus winch assist skidded and versus in the South with tracked versus you know, cut down machines. So it's basically a brute force calculation of every gallon of fuel that we used, then that became multiplied by the emissions factor for either diesel or gasoline fuel.
Okay. I know we're coming up on our time here, but I do want to ask one question, just kind of looking forward. Are there any gaps that you see in your sustainability practices and priorities? And if so, what internal or external pressures might motivate those next steps?
I think we're always looking at gaps. Our forest certification programs are always third-party audited. We are third-party audited every year, and they always come up with recommendations on things that maybe we could do a little bit differently or improve. And we do that. So it's a continuous improvement process. That's part of SFI and part of the FSC. So we always do that. We've been doing that every year. You know, we've also identified a number of gaps and problems in the greenhouse gas accounting and the way that these things work. I think the biggest fundamental flaw is the assumption that the forest soils are stable. and that they don't sequester carbon. We know that, when we grow trees faster, the allometric equations would tell us there's more carbon in the coarse roots than there would be if we grew them slower. And yet that doesn't change. We know that those roots persist over multiple rotations, but when you do the analysis using the approach we took, they disappear instantly at the moment they're harvested. And so there's a number of ways, and we've been talking to folks like FAA, the Forest Inventory Analysis Program that does that data, about, hey, there might be a way to improve this with it. And so there's obviously plenty of room to improve the data as we go forward. Absolutely. It's a big question to answer. It's not an easy task, to come up with these estimates, and it's a little hard too sometimes when it's not quite right to continue on, but the commitment we made, we're not going to change it. We're not going to cherry pick the results we like and exclude the ones we don't like. That's not kind of an open and transparent process. So.
Well, I'd like to thank you again for the time and all of the information that you've shared with everyone today. For the participants, the webinar has been recorded, and we will post the recording to our website within a few days. And again, to be included on our mailing list to receive registration details about future events, please email forestc@msu.edu. Thank you again, for your time.
You're
This
welcome.
was very
Thanks.
interesting.
Appreciate it.